The morning Cyrus Hawkins rode into Millhaven, Texas with dust on his coat and a serious expression carved into the lines of his face. He had exactly one thing on his mind: finding someone reliable enough to cook, clean, and keep the ranch house from falling into complete disorder before the cattle season swallowed every waking hour he had left. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was waking up mean and hungry after a winter that had pushed men and cattle alike to their limits. The grass was coming back greener than expected, which meant the herd would fatten up well if he could keep the operation running smoothly on the homestead side of things. Cyrus was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when the heat got to it, and hands that had been calloused since he was 15. He owned 400 acres of decent rangeland, a house that was solid if not beautiful, a barn that smelled of pine resin and horse sweat, and a reputation among his neighbors as a man who was fair, quiet, and utterly incapable of asking for help without it costing him something in his pride. He had let the housekeeper situation go too long. That was the plain truth of it. His cook, old Bart Tillman, had left 2 months prior to go live with his daughter in San Antonio, and since then Cyrus had been eating beans. He burned himself and sleeping in a house that was slowly gathering enough dust to grow its own geography. His ranch hand, a lean young man named Pete Vargas, had been kind enough not to say anything about the state of things, but Cyrus had caught the boy looking at the sink pile more than once with an expression that said everything words might have. So on a Tuesday morning in April, Cyrus rode the 12 miles into Millhaven, tied his horse at the post outside Delmore's general store, and asked if anyone knew of a woman or man looking for seasonal domestic work at the Hawkins spread. He asked the postmaster first, because the postmaster knew everything about everyone in a 30-mile radius. The postmaster, a small man named Gerald Finch, scratched behind his ear and said, "You know, there's a family just come into town about a week ago. The Atwood women. They're staying over at the boarding house on Cooper Street. The oldest daughter, Adelaide, she's been asking around for work. She's capable from what I hear." Mother and younger sister came with her. Cyrus thanked him, bought a tin of tobacco he didn't particularly need, and walked the 2 blocks down to the boarding house on Cooper Street. The boarding house was a long, pale yellow building run by a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who met him at the door with the suspicious expression of a woman who had seen enough men walk through her threshold to be skeptical about all of them. He explained what he was looking for, and she pointed him toward the back porch, where she said the Atwood girl was taking in the morning air. He found Adelaide Atwood standing at the porch railing with a tin cup of coffee in both hands, looking out at the dusty street behind the building, as though she was reading something in the landscape that wasn't visible to anyone else. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman of that era, with auburn hair pinned up at the back of her neck in a practical knot that had a few wisps escaping from it in the warm Texas wind. Her dress was clean but visibly mended at the hem, and her boots were the kind that had covered a great deal of ground. She had a composed, watchful quality about her that reminded Cyrus of a woman who had made her peace with hard circumstances and was now simply working through them one morning at a time. She heard his boots on the wooden porch and turned to face him without flinching or stepping back, which he noticed. "Adelaide Atwood," he said. "That's me," she said. Her voice was even, neither warm nor cold, just direct. "You're looking for someone." "I am," he said. "My name is Cyrus Hawkins. I have a ranch about 12 miles northeast of here, the Hawkins spread, and I'm looking for someone to run the house through the season. Cook, keep things in order, maybe help tend the kitchen garden if there's willingness. I can pay fair wages and you'd have your own room." Adelaide looked at him steadily for a moment. She set her coffee cup down on the railing and crossed her arms, not in a hostile way but in the manner of a woman thinking something through thoroughly. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hawkins," she said, "and I want to be honest with you before we go any further because I find it saves everyone time." "That's fine," he said. "Be honest." "My mother and my younger sister are with me," she said. We came west from Arkansas together because we had nothing left there to stay for. My father passed last year and the farm we had was under lien and went to creditors. The three of us have been making our way together, and I don't intend to leave them behind in a boarding house to go work somewhere else. So if you're hiring me, the situation would be that my mother and my sister would come along as well. Cyrus looked at her. He had come to hire one person. One. He ran the numbers in his head quickly, which was a habit of his, and thought about the size of the ranch house, the work that needed doing, what fair wages would look like across 3 people, what the practical arrangement would mean for his daily life. "How old is your sister?" he asked. "Nora is 19, Adelaide said. "She's strong and capable and she doesn't complain. My mother, Ruth, is 53. She has a bad knee that slows her down some, but she can cook better than anyone I've ever met, and she sews and mends and tends a garden like it's a calling. None of us are looking for charity. We would all work." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came here intending to hire one person." "I know," Adelaide said. "And if that's what you need and nothing more, then I understand and I wish you luck finding the right person." She picked up her coffee cup again and looked out at the street, and there was nothing in her posture that was begging or pleading. She was simply a woman who had stated her terms and was comfortable waiting to see what the world did with them. Something about that straightness in her spine, that quiet dignity in the way she held herself, made Cyrus Hawkins do something he almost never did, which was make a decision without calculating it down to the last cent first. "I'll hire all 3, he said. Adelaide turned back to him slowly. There was a flash of something in her eyes, relief, gratitude, something that looked briefly like it might become emotion, but she composed it quickly and nodded. "We can be ready to leave by tomorrow morning," she said. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "I need to ride back and get the house in a condition that won't embarrass me in front of your mother." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the suggestion of one, and he caught it on his way back down the porch steps and carried it with him for the 12-mile ride home without quite realizing he was doing so. He spent the next day in a focused frenzy that his ranch hand Pete watched with visible bewilderment. Cyrus swept floors, hauled water, made the 2 spare bedrooms in the house habitable, chopped a fresh supply of wood, and scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood grain showed clean and pale. Pete offered to help once, and Cyrus waved him off with a look that said clearly this was a private matter, then felt slightly embarrassed about the intensity of his own domestic efforts, and went back to scrubbing things anyway. When he returned to Millhaven on the appointed morning with the wagon, he found the 3 Atwood women waiting outside the boarding house with everything they owned packed into 2 trunks and a pair of canvas bags. They were standing in a row of sorts, though not formally, and the sight of them struck him with something he couldn't immediately name. Ruth Atwood, the mother, was a shorter woman than Adelaide, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of face that had been beautiful once, and was now something even better, which was full of character. She had Adelaide's same steadiness in her expression, but warmer, with smile lines at the corners of her eyes. Her bad knee was visible in the slight way she favored her left side, but she stood straight and carried her own bag without asking for help. Nora Atwood, the younger sister, was a complete contrast in manner to Adelaide, though they shared the same auburn coloring. Where Adelaide was measured and quiet, Nora was bright-eyed and openly curious, turning to look at everything around her with an expression of lively interest. She was 19 and looked it, in the good sense, which meant she carried a kind of unguarded energy that hadn't been worn down yet by too much difficulty. Cyrus helped load the trunks without unnecessary conversation, helped Ruth up onto the wagon seat because he could see the knee was making the step difficult, and then they were rolling northeast across the dry spring landscape with the wagon creaking and the horses' hooves raising small puffs of dust on the road. Nora asked him 3 questions before they had cleared the town limits. What kind of cattle did he run? How many hands did he have? Had he ever been to Colorado, because she had heard Colorado was extraordinary? He answered all three, and when he answered the Colorado one that no, he had not been to Colorado, but he had been told the mountains there were worth the journey, Nora said with complete sincerity. Adelaide says I ask too many questions. Adelaide might be right, Ruth said from beside him on the wagon seat, and she said it so gently that Nora laughed instead of taking offense. Adelaide was sitting in the wagon bed with her back against one of the trunks, watching the landscape with that same reading expression she'd had on the porch. Cyrus didn't look back at her often, but when he did, she met his eyes briefly and easily, as though she was simply confirming something to herself, and then looked back at the passing land. The ranch announced itself first as a smell cattle, grass, and the faint sweet char of yesterday's cooking fire, and then as a shape against the wide Texas sky, the low house and the bigger barn and the scattered outbuildings taking form out of the heat shimmer as the wagon rolled up the drive. Ruth said, quietly and with what sounded like genuine feeling, "Oh, it's a good piece of land." "Yes, ma'am," Cyrus said, and he felt an unreasonable amount of pleasure at the words. He showed them the house. He watched Ruth walk through the kitchen and seen her eyes sharpen with a cook's assessment, noting the stove, the pantry, the state of the shelves, working out what was there and what was needed with the swift competence of someone who had kept a household fed for 30 years. He watched Nora poke her head into the barn and immediately introduce herself to the horses by name, which she invented on the spot, and which the horses seemed to accept without complaint. He showed Adelaide the 2 spare bedrooms, one for her and Nora together, one for Ruth, and watched her look at them carefully, run her finger along the window sill, check the latch on the door, assess the room with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. "You cleaned this recently," she said. "Day before yesterday," he said. "For our arrival," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him with those steady eyes, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said only as much as she needed to. "Thank you," she said. "That was considerate." He went back outside because he needed to check on the horses, and also because the room had begun to feel like it was a slightly smaller space than it had been a moment before. The first week was a period of everyone finding their rhythm. Ruth established herself in the kitchen with quiet authority, and within 2 days the ranch house smelled like real food again: beans that hadn't been burned, cornbread, stewed meat, coffee that was strong and hot and exactly as it should be. Pete Vargas, who ate his meals at the house, became visibly happier with each passing day and developed the habit of arriving for supper slightly earlier than necessary. Cyrus could not blame him. Nora turned out to be genuinely capable with the horses, which was not what Cyrus had expected, but which solved a problem he hadn't known he had, which was that the 2 younger horses he'd brought in that spring were skittish and needed more groundwork than he and Pete had time to give them. Nora worked with them in the corral with a patient, unhurried confidence that was at odds with her generally energetic manner. She spoke to the horses constantly, a steady, low conversation of encouragement and observation, and within 3 days the younger bay was accepting the saddle without a fight. "Where did you learn to work horses like that?" he asked her one afternoon, leaning on the corral fence. "My father taught me," she said, rubbing the bay's nose. "He said the horse is always telling you something, you just have to be quiet enough to hear it." He thought about that. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." Nora's expression shifted into something that was grief held at a slight distance, the way you carry something heavy when you've been carrying it long enough to know how. "He was," she said. "He was the best kind of man there is, the kind that doesn't make a show of it." Cyrus nodded, because he understood that particular kind of tribute. Adelaide ran the house. That was the simple way to put it, but it didn't capture the particular quality of how she did it, which was without fuss or announcement. Things simply got done. The laundry appeared clean and folded. The floors stopped holding dust. The kitchen garden, which had been a neglected rectangle of packed earth, was turned and planted within the first week, Adelaide working it in the evenings after the house tasks were finished, on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose in the heat. He started finding reasons to be in the vicinity of whatever she was doing, which was something he noticed about himself with a combination of interest and suspicion. He had lived alone for 3 years since his engagement to a woman named Clara Bassett had dissolved when Clara had decided, with perfect fairness, that she didn't want a life 12 miles from the nearest town with a man who talked more to cattle than to people. He had accepted the end of that relationship with the same equanimity he brought to most things, and had not particularly expected to find himself doing this again. This slow gravitational pull toward another person that he recognized now, belatedly, for what it was. He found himself in the kitchen garden on a Wednesday evening 2 weeks into the arrangement, crouching down to look at what she was planting. "Tomatoes," she said without looking up, "and squash along the east side where the afternoon shade will cool them, and I found some dried bean seeds in the pantry that should still be viable." "You know a good deal about gardens," he said. "I know what we need to eat," she said. "That amounts to the same thing in the end." He stayed there for a moment, aware that he was crouching in a kitchen garden with no practical reason to be there, and that she was perfectly aware of this too. Then she looked up at him, and there was something different in her expression, a slight softening around the eyes, the smallest possible hint of warmth. "You could hand me those seeds," she said, nodding at the small paper packet on the ground beside him. He handed them over, and when his fingers touched hers briefly in the exchange, the warmth in her eyes shifted, became more specific, and they both looked at their own hands for a moment before looking at something else. He stood up, said good night, and walked back toward the barn to do nothing in particular for 20 minutes while his heart did something he hadn't asked it to do. The weeks deepened into May, and the ranch came alive with the hard business of the cattle season. Cyrus and Pete were out before light every morning, pushing the herd to the better grass on the north pasture, checking fence lines, dealing with the 1,000 daily emergencies that cattle produce simply by being cattle. He came home tired and dusty and often late, and found supper kept warm for him on the stove without fail, and a lamp left burning on the table. It was the lamp that got to him, if he was being honest with himself. It was such a small thing. Just a lamp left burning, so he wouldn't come into a dark house. Ruth said she was the one who left it, and that might have been true the first time, but he had walked past Adelaide's window on the way to the porch one late evening and seen her light still on, and he knew it was her. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed it every time. One evening in late May, a dust storm came in fast from the west with the particular viciousness that the Texas panhandle reserved for the unwary. He and Pete got the horses into the barn just as the sky went brown, and the wind became a wall, and then he was running for the house through air that was mostly dirt, following the line of the fence by feel because he couldn't see past his own arm. He came through the back door choking on dust to find all 3 women already at the window shutters, getting them latched against the wind. Ruth had wrapped a wet cloth around her lower face. Nora was wrestling with the stubborn shutter on the north window. Adelaide was calm in the middle of the room with a lamp held high, directing operations with a voice that cut cleanly through the roar of the wind. "Nora, use the back edge of your elbow on that latch. It sticks on the left side," she was saying. "Mother, the window in the bedroom is still open." Ruth disappeared toward the bedroom. Nora got the shutter latched. Adelaide lowered the lamp and turned to see him standing in the doorway, dust-covered and somewhat battered-looking, and the warmth came into her eyes immediately. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, "just embarrassed by the weather." She made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he had heard from her, and it was so unexpectedly full and genuine that he stopped thinking about the storm entirely for a moment. She brought him a wet cloth, and he cleaned his face. And then the 4 of them sat out the storm around the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the wind howling against the shuttered windows and the whole house shuddering occasionally in the gusts. Ruth told a story about a storm she had lived through in Arkansas when Adelaide was a baby. Nora drew patterns on the table with her finger. Adelaide sewed a shirt that was missing 2 buttons, working by the lamp with small, precise stitches. Cyrus watched her sew and thought about things he hadn't thought about in 3 years. "You're staring," Nora said to him conversationally. Adelaide looked up and their eyes met, and neither of them looked away quite as quickly as they probably should have. "I'm thinking," he said. "You think with your eyes pointed at my sister," Nora said, and was so innocent about it that he genuinely could not tell if she was being deliberately provocative or simply reporting an observation as she saw it. Ruth pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was suppressing a smile. Adelaide returned to her sewing with the careful attention of a woman who had decided not to contribute to this particular conversation. Cyrus picked up his coffee cup. The storm passed by midnight. By morning, everything was covered in a fine red dust, and the world looked scrubbed and strange and clear in the way it always did after a blow. He was up before light and found Adelaide already in the kitchen, coffee made, standing at the back door looking out at the dust-rearranged yard with her arms crossed and an expression of quiet appraisal. He stood beside her in the doorway, not close enough to crowd her, just beside her. "We'll need to check the garden," she said, "and the rain barrel might have taken dust in." "I'll check the rain barrel," he said. "You check the garden." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning was pink and still and smelled of dust and the faint sweetness of the prairie grass drying in the early heat. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Cyrus," he said. "We've been living in the same house for 6 weeks. I think you can call me Cyrus." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Cyrus," just the word, trying it out, and the shape of it in her mouth was something he was going to remember for a long time. "Adelaide," he said back to her, equally quiet. She looked away first that time, out at the pink morning, and he saw the color that came into her cheek and felt something settle into place in his chest like a piece of sky that had been wrong in the frame and had finally been corrected. He checked the rain barrel. She checked the garden. 2 of the tomato plants were laid over, but none were broken, and she staked them back up with the methodical competence he had come to expect from her in all things. June arrived, and with it a complication Cyrus had not anticipated in the form of a neighboring rancher named Donovan Stiles, who ran cattle on the land to the west and had a reputation for being broadly unpleasant and specifically quarrelsome about property lines. Stiles had been letting his cattle drift east across the unmarked southern boundary of the Hawkins property for the better part of 2 seasons, and this year the drift was more aggressive, with a substantial portion of Stiles's herd mixed into Cyrus's south pasture in a way that was going to require a long, uncomfortable sorting. Cyrus rode out to deal with it on a Monday morning and came home Monday evening with a jaw set tight and a mood that Pete recognized and gave a wide berth. But when he came into the kitchen, Ruth had made fried chicken and biscuits, and Nora had set the table properly with the good tin plates, and Adelaide looked at his face with those reading eyes of hers and set a cup of coffee in front of him before he had even sat down. "Stiles again?" she asked. He looked up at her. "How did you know about Stiles?" "Gerald Finch mentioned him when I went into town for flour last week," she said. "He said Stiles has been a problem for most of the ranchers on this side of the county for years." "Finch talks too much," Cyrus said, but he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and felt the tight thing in his chest ease slightly. "Gerald Finch talks exactly the right amount," Ruth said from the stove, with the authority of a woman who had assessed the postmaster and reached a final verdict. "He told me about the church social coming up the 3rd Saturday of the month. He said it's the main gathering of the season and that most families come from 30 miles around." Cyrus blinked. He had, in fact, completely forgotten about the church social. This was not unusual for him. "Right," he said. "We should go," Nora said, with the immediate conviction of someone who had been hoping for a social event since she arrived. "All of us. Adelaide needs to meet people, not just sit here in the garden all the time." Adelaide sat down across from Cyrus with her own plate and gave her sister a look. "I like the garden," she said. "I know you like the garden," Nora said. "I also think you could stand to be in a room with people other than the 4 of us and the horses." Cyrus looked at Adelaide across the table. She was looking at her biscuit. There was a little smile at the corner of her mouth that she was managing carefully, like a small fire she was deciding whether to let grow. "We'll go to the social," he said, and the decision surprised him somewhat, because he generally found social gatherings to be a significant effort. Adelaide looked up at him quickly and then back down. The little smile won. The third Saturday of June arrived clear and hot and full of the particular electricity that the Texas panhandle got in early summer, when the sky was too blue and the heat came up from the ground and met the sun coming down and the air between got crowded. Cyrus had cleaned up properly, which for him meant a pressed shirt and boots that didn't have yesterday's mud on them. And when he came out of his room and found Adelaide standing in the main room waiting for the others, he lost approximately 4 seconds of practical thought. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep blue that was the color of the sky just before dark, with a white collar and her hair done up differently than usual, with small curls at the sides that had probably taken her considerable effort in the mirror. She was not a woman who made a show of her appearance, which made the moments when she clearly had made an effort carry an entirely disproportionate weight. "You look," he started. "The buckle on the left harness strap needs replacing," she said, because she had been checking the wagon while he was getting ready and had noticed it. He blinked. "Thank you," he said. "You look very fine, Adelaide." She looked at him steadily and the color came into both her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, and it came out softer than usual, and for a moment the room was very quiet. Nora came in behind them at full volume asking where she'd put her good hat, and the moment dissolved, but it left something behind it like warmth on a wall after the sun has moved. The social was held at the Baptist church and the grounds around it, with tables set up in the yard and a fiddle player and a guitarist providing music from the shade of the oak tree. There were perhaps 200 people, which for that part of Texas was a considerable gathering. Cyrus introduced the Atwood women to the neighbors he knew, and noted that Ruth was immediately recognized by 2 other women as a person of good sense, and drawn into a conversation about kitchen gardening that lasted the better part of an hour, and that Nora attached herself to a group of young people her own age with the ease of someone who had never met a stranger in her life. Adelaide stayed nearer to him. Not clinging, she was not a woman who clung to things, but present in the easy way that she was beginning to be present in his daily thoughts, available and natural. He introduced her to Thomas Reeves, the county land agent, and to the Mortimer family from the neighboring property to the north, and to Pastor Ellison, who was a broad, cheerful man who shook Adelaide's hand warmly and asked how she was finding Texas after Arkansas. "Bigger," Adelaide said. "And drier," Cyrus added. "And louder," she said, with a look at Nora across the yard, who was currently in the middle of some energetic explanation involving her arms. Thomas Reeves, who was a widower in his 40s with a thoughtful manner and kind eyes, lingered near Adelaide longer than was strictly necessary for an introduction, and Cyrus felt a reaction to this that he examined with some interest and identified without much ambiguity as jealousy, which was new information about his own inner state. He said nothing about it, because he was not a man who said things before he was sure of them. But he found himself standing closer to Adelaide for the rest of the afternoon, in a way that was not strictly accidental. On the wagon ride home, with the evening coming on in shades of gold and orange and the prairie stretching away on both sides, Nora fell asleep against Ruth's shoulder and Ruth herself was drowsing, and Cyrus and Adelaide were left in a quiet pocket at the front of the wagon seat with the horses walking easy and the air beginning to cool. "You don't like crowds," Adelaide said. "Is it that obvious?" he said. "Only if you're paying attention," she said. "Were you paying attention?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "I generally am," she said. "I find you interesting to pay attention to." It was the most direct thing she had said to him that was not about household management, and he felt the weight of it, the considered nature of it, because Adelaide Atwood was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. "I find you considerably more interesting to pay attention to," he said, "in case that's not been clear." The evening light was coming directly across the prairie now at the flat golden angle of late June, and it caught the side of her face and the loose curl at her temple and made everything look like something painted rather than lived. She looked at the horses' backs for a moment, then at her hands in her lap, then at him. "It's been somewhat clear," she said. "I want to be more clear," he said. "That would be acceptable," she said, and there was that small smile again, the one she kept carefully managed, and this time he made a decision the same way he had made the decision to hire all three of them, with less calculation than usual and with a certainty that came from somewhere below arithmetic. "Adelaide," he said, "I am asking if you would allow me to court you properly." The prairie rolled by. A night bird called somewhere in the darkening grass. Nora snored softly. "I would allow that," Adelaide said. "I think I'd welcome it." He released a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and she made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Were you nervous?" she said. "Somewhat," he said. "Good," she said, and then was surprised by herself and pressed her lips together. And this time the smile won completely, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything so worth riding 12 miles for. He courted her with the same deliberate steadiness he brought to most things, but warmer, and with a thoughtfulness that she seemed to genuinely notice and value. He brought her a book from town. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she had liked reading before the hard years had made time for it scarce. A copy of Middlemarch that the store in Millhaven had received in a shipment, and that he had asked after specifically, because he remembered the title she had mentioned. He found it on the shelf and carried it home with the careful air of a man transporting something fragile, which the storekeeper found amusing and which he ignored. She looked at it for a long moment when he gave it to her, sitting at the table after supper, and ran her thumb along the spine in a way that was entirely unguarded and told him everything. "I didn't think you'd remembered," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said, which was the plain truth. She looked up at him, and the warmth in her eyes was steady and deep and wholly directed at him, and he pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, and they talked for 2 hours while Ruth and Nora diplomatically occupied themselves elsewhere. And the lamp burned low and the night settled in around the house. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, without either of them marking the exact moment, they became people who told each other things they didn't tell anyone else. He told her about Clara because it was honest and she deserved honesty, and he told it plainly without bitterness because he had genuinely made his peace with it. He said that Clara had been right to want something different and that he hoped she had found it. Adelaide was quiet for a moment and then said she was a fool. He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily. "She was not a fool," he said. "She just knew herself." "A person can know themselves and still make foolish choices," Adelaide said. "You are the kind of man a woman should count herself lucky to have found." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most true things, and then looked back at her book cover as though she had simply noted the weather. He could have said things then that would have been easier, softer, less significant. Instead, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers where it rested on the book cover. She turned her hand over slowly until her palm was against his, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight with the book between them and the night outside and the rest of the world elsewhere. July came in hard and hot, and the cattle work intensified. There were days when Cyrus came home so tired that he ate supper in silence and fell asleep in his chair before he had finished his coffee, and Adelaide never made him feel anything about this except cared for. She would put a quilt over him when he slept in the chair, and in the morning the coffee was ready before he opened his eyes. The trouble with Donovan Styles came to a head in the middle of July. Styles arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon while Cyrus was in the south pasture, and Adelaide met him at the door. She told Cyrus about it that evening in a calm, sequential way that suggested she had thought about how to present it clearly. Styles had been rude. That was the short version. He had made remarks about her presence at the ranch that were disrespectful in the specific way that men of his sort used against women who were living outside of the arrangements he understood as proper. He had asked, in terms that were not polite, what 3 women were doing living on Cyrus Hawkins's property. Adelaide had told him they were employed there, and that any business he had was with Cyrus and could wait until Cyrus returned, and had closed the door. Cyrus had gone very still when she told him this. The stillness was not peace. It was the particular stillness of a man holding something controlled that would prefer not to be. "Did he say anything threatening?" he asked. "Not exactly," she said. "He was the kind of rude that stays just short of a clear threat, so there's nothing to point to." "I'll talk to him," Cyrus said. "I know you will," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know, not because I need rescuing." He looked at her. She looked back with that level clarity that he had come to understand was simply how she was, a woman who managed her own business completely and told him things as an equal, not as someone petitioning for his assistance. "I understand that," he said. "I'm going to talk to him anyway." "Of course you are," she said, and there was a warmth in the words that made clear she didn't disapprove. He rode to Styles's property the next morning, and had a conversation with Styles that was short and extremely clear in its content, which was that the drift of Styles's cattle onto Hawkins' land was going to stop, and that Styles was going to conduct himself with basic respect around the Hawkins property and everyone on it. Or there were going to be formal complaints filed with the county land office, and every neighboring rancher who had also been suffering from the boundary problems was going to be enlisted in making those complaints loud. Styles was a bully of the type that responded to clarity and was substantially less intimidating when met with it directly. He was not friendly at the end of the conversation, but he was quieter, and the cattle drift stopped within the week. When Cyrus told Adelaide how the conversation had gone, she nodded once with the satisfied expression of someone who had known what the outcome would be. "You didn't doubt it," he said. "Not for a moment," she said. "I could have handled it poorly," he said. "No," she said simply, "you couldn't have." The faith in those 3 words was so complete and so unsentimental that he had to look away for a moment at the wall, because what he felt was too large for the kitchen. August was harvest season in the garden, and the fullness of the cattle season rolled together into a kind of orchestrated abundance that reminded Cyrus why he had chosen this life even in the years when it was purely difficult. The tomatoes came in heavy and red, and Ruth canned them in rows of glowing jars along the pantry shelf. The squash came on, and Adelaide made a soup from them that he ate 2 bowls of and then looked embarrassed about. Nora had gotten the 2 young horses not just trained but genuinely good, and Pete Vargas, who had been riding the better of the 2 on the north pasture runs, brought it back one afternoon with the particular satisfied expression of a man who has been given a horse that works exactly as a horse should work. "She's a gift with horses," Pete said of Nora, with admiration that had no ulterior motive in it, only the pure appreciation of one working person for another's skill. Then he looked at Cyrus. "You did good when you hired these 3, boss." "I know," Cyrus said. "I mean it was a risk," Pete said, "because you came into town to hire one person. I know, Pete." Pete looked at the garden where Adelaide was staking up a late planting of beans with the sleeves of her dress rolled up and her hair coming loose in the August heat. "And you did real good," he said again, specifically. "Pete," Cyrus said. "I'm just noting it," Pete said innocently, and went to unsaddle his horse. The first real conversation between Cyrus and Adelaide about the future came on an August evening when the heat was finally breaking, and they had taken to sitting on the front porch after supper, a habit that had developed naturally without either of them proposing it. Ruth and Nora were inside. Ruth was teaching Nora to play cards with the worn deck from the sideboard drawer, which Nora was taking to with enormous competitive intensity, and the prairie was making its evening sounds, the crickets and the distant cattle and the soft movement of the grass. "What happens in October?" Adelaide said, not looking at him, looking at the prairie. He knew what she meant. The season ended in October. The arrangement they had was for the season. He had been thinking about this for 3 weeks and had not yet figured out how to say what he wanted to say, because what he wanted to say was considerable, and he was not entirely sure of his reception despite all available evidence. "That depends," he said. "On what?" she said. "On whether you'd be willing to hear something important," he said. She turned to look at him then, fully and directly, and folded her hands in her lap and waited with the patience of a woman who had learned to listen to things completely before she responded. "I have been waiting for the right moment to say this," he said. "And I've come to the conclusion that I am waiting for a right moment that is not going to arrive, because I am not a man who is comfortable with speeches, and the longer I wait the less I'll say it properly, so I'm just going to say it plainly and trust that you'll understand what I mean." "I generally understand what you mean," she said. "Adelaide," he said, "I want to ask you to stay, permanently, not as my housekeeper, as my wife." He paused. "Your mother and Nora would have their home here as long as they wanted it. This would be their home as much as mine. I'd like that. I think this house has needed them in it for a long time, and it just didn't know it." He paused again. "I'd like to think it needed you most of all." The evening was very still. The crickets kept their steady rhythm in the grass. Adelaide's expression had moved through something during his words. He had watched it happen and couldn't entirely name what he had seen, but it was a kind of opening, the way a window moves when the latch finally releases. "You're not doing this because it's convenient," she said. "No," he said. "I am doing this because I have been in love with you since approximately the second week of April, and I have been managing it badly ever since." She made a sound between a laugh and a breath and then pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, and when she lowered it her eyes were bright. "I have been in love with you since the Wednesday you crouched in the garden and handed me those bean seeds and had no practical reason to be there at all," she said. He stared at her. "That was the second week of April," he said. "Yes," she said, and her smile was full and unmanaged and warm as August. He reached across the porch bench and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his with the easy certainty of a woman who had been waiting to do exactly this for 4 months and was done waiting now. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," she said. "An absolute yes." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not a thing he had done before in his life, and which he had perhaps learned from something written in a book on a shelf somewhere. And she made a soft sound that was not quite any word but was everything that needed to be said. From inside the house came the sudden exclamation of Nora shouting what sounded like victory over the card game, followed by Ruth's calm voice saying something that made Nora laugh. And the ordinary music of a household, fully lived in, came out through the open window and wrapped around the two of them on the porch. And Cyrus Hawkins thought that this particular evening was going to be one he would carry for the rest of his life as the marker for when everything became what it was supposed to be. They told Ruth first, the following morning. Ruth listened to Cyrus's brief and direct statement of his intentions with the expression of a woman hearing news she has been expecting and is perfectly satisfied by. When he finished, she looked at Adelaide, and Adelaide looked at her, and something passed between them that was entirely mother and daughter, and beyond his reach to interpret, but which ended with Ruth taking Adelaide's hands in both of hers and holding them for a moment. Then she looked at Cyrus and said, "You are a good man, Mr. Hawkins. My husband would have liked you. You have his kind of steadiness." He didn't trust his voice for a moment, so he just nodded, and Ruth patted his arm once with great practicality and went to put more coffee on. Nora's reaction was louder and more comprehensive. She said she knew it, that she had known it since the storm in May, that she had told Ruth so at the time, and that Adelaide was the last person in the house to figure anything out obviously. Then she hugged Adelaide so hard that Adelaide made a sound of protest, and then held her just as hard in return, and Cyrus went to check on something in the barn, because the look on Adelaide's face when she held her sister was not something he was prepared to observe without a corresponding feeling in his chest that needed a private moment to settle. Pete, when told the news later that day, said, "Well, boss." "Good," and shook his hand, and that was the entirety of Pete's formal reaction. but he went around for the rest of the day with the pleased expression of a man whose household has just become permanently secure, which in a practical sense it had. They were married in September, on a clear Saturday that felt like the best of the year. Pastor Ellison came out from Millhaven, and there were neighbors, the Mortimers, old Gerald Finch, several families from the social, gathered in the yard of the ranch house that Adelaide and Ruth and Nora had made beautiful with what they had, which was late summer wildflowers from the prairie and lanterns hung in the branches of the 2 pecan trees near the porch, and the wedding cake that Ruth had baked, which was a high, proud thing that represented the serious application of skill and love. Adelaide wore her blue dress. He had expected the blue dress, and still the sight of her coming out of the house toward him across the sunlit yard, with Ruth behind her and Nora walking beside her, and the prairie sky enormous and blue behind them all, made everything in him go quiet and attentive in the way the best moments do. He had written his vows in the evenings over the preceding 2 weeks, and had kept the paper folded in his breast pocket, and practiced them, until he could say them without referring to the paper. When the moment came, he did look at the paper once, not because he had forgotten, but because looking at something he had written carefully gave his hand something to do with the feeling that was otherwise going to be obvious in his expression. He said that he took her as his wife with the full understanding of everything that meant, and that he intended to be the kind of husband who showed up, who stayed, who worked alongside her, and listened to her, and never made her feel like she was asking for too much when she asked for what she needed. He said he was grateful for the whole of the Atwood family, and he meant it, because he had meant it from the beginning. Adelaide's vows were shorter and more precise, which was entirely her. She said she had come west with nothing she wanted to keep, and had found more than she had known how to want, and that she intended to spend her life making sure he knew it. When the pastor said the words and he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band from Millhaven, nothing elaborate but solid and real, and when she looked up at him with those steady eyes that saw everything clearly, he understood for the first time in his life what it meant to be fully seen by another person, and to be glad of it. He kissed her because the pastor said so, and because he had been thinking about very little else for 4 months, and when she kissed him back, it was with the particular warmth of a woman who doesn't do anything by half measures, and someone behind them, almost certainly Nora, made a sound of extreme satisfaction. The afternoon was full of food and music. The fiddle player from the church social was persuaded to come out again, and Cyrus danced with Adelaide on the packed earth of the yard, while the late September light came down gold and low, and the neighbors clapped along, and Pete Vargas danced with Nora, and managed to look very surprised that he was enjoying himself, and Ruth sat with Mrs. Mortimer under the pecan trees and watched all of it with an expression of quiet, completed happiness. He danced badly. He had always danced badly, and had stopped pretending otherwise sometime around the age of 25. Adelaide danced well enough for both of them, and when he stepped on her foot she laughed openly and fully, the way she laughed when she forgot to manage it, and it was the best sound in the yard. "I told you I was a poor dancer," he said. "You did not tell me that," she said. "I was planning to tell you eventually," he said. "What else were you planning to tell me eventually?" she said. "Several things," he said. "We have time." She looked up at him with the sunset over her shoulder, and the music moving around them, and the whole of the life they were just beginning stretching out behind her eyes like the prairie stretched behind her head, wide and real, and full of possibility. "Yes," she said, "we have time." The autumn came in with a sweep of color across the grassland and the long, satisfying work of the fall roundup that pushed Cyrus and Pete through 6 weeks of hard days and tired evenings. But the evenings were different now. The lamp was still burning when he came in, but now there was someone in the room when he came through the door, and that someone turned from whatever she was doing and met his eyes, and the day's tiredness became manageable in a way it had never been before. Ruth and Nora had settled into the ranch house as though they had always been there, which Cyrus had said to Adelaide one evening, and which she had accepted as the natural state of things. Ruth's kitchen was now indisputably Ruth's kitchen, and no one including Cyrus had any objection to this. The pantry was full, the meals were reliable, the house was warm and ordered and alive in a way that a house becomes when people who intend to stay are living in it. Nora, it turned out, had a talent for more than horses. She had an instinct for the land itself, for reading weather and grass conditions and what the cattle were telling you with their behavior. And Cyrus found himself in conversations with her about the pasture management that were genuinely useful. She was 19 and learning at the rate of someone who absorbs things through engagement and interest rather than instruction. And by the end of October, he had told Pete that she was doing work worth a full hand's wages, and Pete had nodded as if this confirmed something he had already known. There was a moment in November when Cyrus found Nora sitting on the top rail of the corral fence in the cold morning, looking north across the land with an expression that had the same quality Adelaide's expression had sometimes, that quality of reading the landscape for something. He leaned on the fence beside her, and they were quiet for a while. "Do you miss Arkansas?" he said. Nora thought about it with genuine consideration, which he appreciated because she wasn't someone who answered important questions carelessly. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss the version of Arkansas that had him in it. The rest of it," she shook her head. "We had lost too much there." "You can't miss a place that's become a place where you couldn't breathe," he nodded. "This place suits you," he said. "Yes," she said, and there was a simplicity in it, a settled quality that told him she had made her peace with the direction her life had taken and that the peace was genuine. "It suits all three of you," he said. "I'm glad you came." She looked at him with Adelaide's eyes in a slightly more openly expressive face. "She loves you very much, you know," she said. "Adelaide. She's not a woman who," she stopped, finding the right words. "She's careful. She's always been careful with herself. She doesn't give trust easily because she knows what it costs. So when she gives it to you," she looked back at the north pasture, "it means everything." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Good," she said, "because she deserves everything back." He took that in. "I intend to give it," he said. Nora nodded once with great authority as though a ruling had been rendered and climbed down from the fence to go about her morning work. Winter settled on the Texas Panhandle with its particular brand of ferocity, the kind of cold that came in from the north with nothing between it and you for 1,000 miles. The days were short and bright and crystalline, and the house was warm with the stove and the bodies of people living together, and the particular warmth of a household that is content. Adelaide was reading Middlemarch for the second time, and had reached the point of telling him about it in the evenings in the way people narrate books to those they love, not recapping but sharing, which meant occasionally saying, "Look at this," and reading him a passage, and then looking up to see if he had understood what she was trying to convey. He generally had, because he listened to her with the attention she deserved. He had started reading more himself that winter, partly because the cold kept the outdoor work shorter and partly because he had discovered that books were easier to discuss with Adelaide than he had previously known, and discussing things with Adelaide had become one of the central pleasures of his existence. On a January evening when the wind was doing something earnest to the windows and the fire was high and the whole household was settled in the main room, Ruth with her mending, Nora writing a letter she had been composing for 3 evenings, Cyrus with a book of range management he was using more as an excuse to be sitting near his wife than for actual information, Adelaide lowered her book and looked at the fire for a long moment. "Cyrus," she said. "Yes," he said, looking up. She looked at him with those steady reading eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not uncertainty exactly, but was the particular quality of a person preparing to say something that will change the current state of things. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said. The fire crackled. Ruth's needle went still. Nora looked up from her letter. Cyrus felt something happen inside his chest that he did not have an immediate word for, something that was astonishment and joy, and a rush of protective love all arriving simultaneously. and it must have shown in his face in the full and unmanaged way that things rarely showed in his face, because Adelaide's expression shifted into a smile so unguarded and warm that he thought he could have read by the light of it. He reached out and took her hand, as he had on that August evening on the porch, and held it. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "Dr. Abernathy in town would need to confirm it," but she looked at him steadily. "I am fairly certain." "We'll go to town Thursday," he said. Ruth made a sound from across the room that was not words but carried the full weight of a grandmother's joy, and Nora was on her feet and across the room with her arms around Adelaide before Adelaide had even registered she was moving, which made Adelaide laugh that full, unmanaged laugh, and Cyrus held her hand through the whole of it, and thought that the house, already full, had just grown larger than its walls. Dr. Abernathy confirmed it on Thursday. Adelaide was somewhere in her 3rd month. The baby would come in the summer, most likely June or July. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the household in small and practical ways. Ruth quietly took over more of the heavier kitchen work without making any announcement about it, and Adelaide accepted this because she was sensible about her own body, even when she was inclined to continue doing everything she had always done at the same pace. Cyrus checked on her more frequently than was strictly necessary, which she tolerated with good humor. "I am with child," she said one afternoon when she caught him watching her carry a basket of laundry with an expression of barely restrained concern. "I am not made of glass." "I know," he said. "I'll stop." "You won't stop," she said. "I'll try to be less obvious about it," he said. She handed him the laundry basket. "You can carry this then, since you're right here." He carried it. This satisfied both of them. Spring came again, the 2nd spring, and it was different from the first spring in all the ways that matter. The kitchen garden went in with the confidence of the 2nd year, with Adelaide knowing now exactly which bed got what light and Ruth having sourced 2 new varieties of tomato from a catalog that had arrived in March, and which she had studied with the intensity she brought to anything important. Nora had taken on a formal role as second ranch hand alongside Pete, and the two of them had developed a working relationship that was efficient and comfortable, grounded in mutual respect, and the kind of easy banter that comes from people who like each other without complication. The cattle came through the winter well, better than the previous year, and the new calves were coming on strong. Cyrus rode his land in the April mornings, sometimes with Adelaide beside him on the bay mare that Nora had finished training, and he watched Adelaide look at the land with those reading eyes, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man showing something he loves to someone who understands it. "It's a good piece of land," she said, the same words her mother had said from the wagon seat on the first day. "Your mother said that the first morning," he said. "She was right," Adelaide said. "She usually is." She looked at him sideways from the saddle, her hair loose under her hat in the wind, her hand resting on the swell of her belly under her coat. "We're going to be happy here for a long time." "Yes," he said. "We are." He meant it absolutely, and she knew it. The baby came on a Saturday evening in June, which was perfectly in keeping with the rest of the baby's arrangements, as Dr. Abernathy had confirmed the due time was most likely Saturday, and the baby had been entirely cooperative in arriving on the expected schedule. Ruth served as the primary support, with Dr. Abernathy attending, and Cyrus was given a place to wait that was the kitchen, where Pete very generously arrived and sat with him and drank coffee and talked about absolutely nothing important for 3 hours. At approximately 10 in the evening, when the house was full of the serious sounds of a significant thing happening, Nora came to the kitchen doorway and said, "It's a boy." Cyrus stood up so fast he knocked his chair back. "He's fine," Nora said immediately, with her hand up. "Adelaide is fine. Everyone is fine. Mother says come in." He walked down the hallway and through the bedroom door and into a room that smelled of warmth and something new, and Adelaide was sitting up against the pillows with the particular expression of a woman who has just come through something enormous and is on the other side of it with everything intact, which was a kind of quiet triumph unlike any other expression in the human catalog. and in her arms there was a baby, small and red-faced and absolutely furious about the general situation of being in the world, expressing this fury with complete conviction. "Come here," Adelaide said softly. He sat on the edge of the bed and she shifted the baby toward him and he took his son, which was a thought that rearranged something fundamental in his understanding of himself. And the baby looked at him with the unseeing newborn intensity that somehow still feels entirely personal. "He has your coloring," Adelaide said. "Look, dark hair." "He has your chin," he said. "He looks as though he has opinions already." "He came out protesting," Adelaide said. "I think he has your stubbornness and my tendency to speak my mind." "God help the world," he said, and she laughed, tired and full and happy. He looked down at his son and felt the weight of the moment pressing on him from all sides, not heavily but fully, the way the sky presses when you stand under it in the open. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. "I've been thinking," she said. "Nathaniel, after my father, Nathaniel James Hawkins." "Nathaniel," he said, trying it. The baby looked up at the sound of the word, which was probably coincidence and felt like something more. "Hello, Nathaniel." Ruth was in the corner of the room with her hands folded and her eyes very bright, and Nora was behind her with her chin on Ruth's shoulder, both of them watching, and the room was small and full of people who loved each other, and the lamp was burning warm on the table. "Thank you," Cyrus said to Adelaide. She looked at him. "For what?" "For staying," he said. "For all of it." She reached up and touched the side of his face once briefly with her palm, the way people touch things they are very certain of. "I didn't want to go anywhere," she said. Nathaniel James Hawkins spent his first year learning about the world with the particular focused curiosity of a child who has dark hair and quiet eyes, and a tendency to watch everything before he moves toward it. He was, as Adelaide had predicted, opinionated, making his preferences clear on all important matters including meals, sleep, and the specific quilt he wanted to be wrapped in. He was also, as Cyrus discovered with something like humbled astonishment, entirely comfortable in his arms from the beginning, settling with an ease that felt less like an infant's compliance and more like recognition. Ruth was a grandmother of tremendous competence and unsentimental love. Nora was an aunt who treated Nathaniel with the same direct engagement she brought to horses, speaking to him as though he were a full participant in conversations about whatever was happening, and he seemed to appreciate this, watching her face with grave attention whenever she spoke. The ranch entered its third year with the solidity of something that has moved past the question of whether it will work and into the reality of working. The improvements came gradually. A new fence line on the east boundary, a second rain barrel, an expansion of the vegetable garden into what had been scrubland beside the house that Adelaide and Nora cleared together over the course of 2 months with pickaxes and determination. Pete hired on a second hand, a quiet man named Abel Torres, who was competent with cattle and was given the small bunkhouse to sleep in and joined the evening meal as a matter of course, because the Hawkins table had always made room. Thomas Reeves, the land agent who had lingered near Adelaide at the church social 2 years before, came to the ranch in the autumn of the second year on county business and afterward spent a respectful hour talking to Nora about horse breeding, which had become a serious interest of hers. When he rode away, Nora watched him go from the corral fence with an expression that was thoughtful in a way Cyrus had not seen on her face before. He mentioned it to Adelaide that evening, not as gossip, but as an observation from someone who paid attention. "Nora hasn't said anything," Adelaide said. "She wouldn't yet," he said. "She'd think it through first." "She gets that from our father," Adelaide said then. "He's a good man, Reeves." "Yes," he said. "He's a fair and steady man, respected in the county. He lost his wife 4 years ago and he hasn't rushed into anything since." "How old is he?" Adelaide said. 36, he said. "Nora is 20, Adelaide said, thinking it through. "That's not an unreasonable difference," he said carefully. Adelaide looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. "I just want her to be as sure as I was when the time came." He took her hand across the table. "She will be," he said. She's an Atwood woman. Adelaide smiled at that. God help him, she said, echoing his own words from the night of Nathaniel's birth, and he laughed properly this time. And the kitchen was warm and the baby was asleep in the next room and everything was exactly as it should be. Thomas Reeves came back in October with no county business to speak of, which was itself a kind of statement. He stayed to supper, at Ruth's firm insistence, and Cyrus watched him watch Nora across the table with the careful attention of a man who is trying to determine something important and is getting more and more convinced of the answer. He watched Nora talk to Reeves with an openness that was slightly different from her usual openness, warmer in a specific direction. Ruth appeared to notice nothing while clearly noticing everything, which Cyrus recognized as a refined skill that Adelaide also possessed. He said nothing. None of them said anything. But the visiting continued into winter, always with a reason, the reason always thin, and by February there was no longer a pretense of the reason being anything other than Nora herself. On a February afternoon, Cyrus found Nora in the barn brushing the horses with the focused energy she had when she was working something through. "He's going to ask you something," Cyrus said. It wasn't a guess. He had spoken with Reeves the previous week in town, and Reeves had said what he intended to ask and had asked formally, man to man, as the occasion required, whether Cyrus had any objection, which he did not. Nora's brushing slowed. "I know," she said. "How do you feel about it?" he said. She thought for a moment in her Adelaide way, taking her time with the true answer. "Like I've found something I didn't know I was looking for," she said. "Like the land looks after a storm." Cleaned and clear, she looked at him. "Is that ridiculous?" "No," he said. "That's exactly right." She looked down at the brush in her hand. "Mother approves." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" She said, "Because she's made him 3 different meals when he's come to supper," he said. "Your mother feeds people she approves of thoroughly." Nora laughed, and for a moment she was entirely the bright, open 19-year-old who had asked him 3 questions before they'd left Millhaven. And then the laugh settled into something deeper and older, and she was 20 and in love and ready for the next thing. Thomas Reeves asked her the following Sunday. She said yes on the porch of the house where Adelaide had said yes 2 years before, which was not planned but which felt, to everyone who knew the story, like the kind of thing that belongs to a place, once a place has been made happy enough to hold it. The spring of the 3rd year brought 2 pieces of news together in the same month in the way that life sometimes arranges things without asking whether the timing is convenient. The first was Nora's wedding, planned for May, which became the organizing principle of the household for weeks. The second was Adelaide telling Cyrus one morning in March, with those steady eyes and that warm, unguarded smile, that Nathaniel was going to have a sibling sometime around November. He held her for a long moment when she told him, standing in the kitchen in the early morning with the coffee steaming on the stove, and she held him back with her arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while because the morning was speaking for them. Nora's wedding was smaller than Cyrus and Adelaide's had been, which suited both Nora and Thomas, who were people who preferred the quiet celebration to the large one. Pastor Ellison came again, and the Mortimers and Gerald Finch, and Abel Torres stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is very happy for people he respects. Ruth cried, which she had not done at Adelaide's wedding, which she later explained by saying that at Adelaide's wedding she had been too busy being grateful to cry, and at Nora's she had the luxury of just being happy. Thomas Reeves took Nora to his house in Millhaven, which was a proper house on the main street with a porch and a room that became immediately a horse tack storage area, which Thomas accepted with the equanimity of a man who had known exactly what he was choosing. She was 12 miles away, the same 12 miles between the ranch and town that Cyrus had ridden back and forth since the beginning of everything, and Nora rode it often, frequently showing up on a Tuesday with no particular reason other than that she had been in the area and thought she'd see how Nathaniel was doing. Ruth, in the quiet of the house with one daughter married out of it, found a steadiness that was different from the steadiness of managing a full household. She tended the garden with a care that had become love. She cooked for Cyrus and Adelaide and Nathaniel and Pete and Abel, and found in it what she had always found, which was the deep satisfaction of feeding people you care for. She was in her 55th year and her knee was not better, but it was not worse, and she moved through the house and the garden with the deliberate grace of a woman who has found the place where she belongs and is not in any hurry to leave it. On an October evening, Cyrus found her sitting on the front porch as the sun went down, which was where he and Adelaide usually sat, and he sat down beside her because she was his mother-in-law, and because he was genuinely glad of her company. "Do you think about going somewhere else?" he asked. "You could go to Millhaven, be near Nora." Ruth looked at the sunset for a moment. "This is my home," she said, "simple as that. This is where my grandchildren will grow up. This is where Adelaide is." She looked at him. "This is where you are, and you are family to me as much as my own daughters. I am not going anywhere." He felt the words settle into him like water into dry ground. He had not known until she said it how much he had needed to hear it. "Your husband," he said, "he would have liked it here." Ruth's eyes got bright. "He would have loved it," she said. "He was always meant for open land. He would have been out on that pasture with you at sunrise every morning and come home too tired to talk and been entirely happy." She folded her hands. "He would have loved you, Cyrus. He would have said you were his kind of man." He could not answer for a moment. He looked at the sunset. When he had his voice properly under control, he said, "That is about the finest thing anyone has said to me." Ruth patted his arm with the same practicality she had used in the kitchen on the morning of the engagement, and they sat together in the cooling evening and watched the last of the sun go down over the Texas panhandle, and the first stars came out one by one over the wide land. The second baby came in November as promised, a Tuesday morning this time, with the same rain that often comes with November in Texas, and this time there were no 3 hours in the kitchen. Only 2 hours, and then Nora's voice, which carried even through the bedroom door, saying in an entirely delighted tone that there was a girl. Adelaide's second child was dark-eyed and calm from the first, nothing like Nathaniel's furious arrival, simply arriving and looking at the world with the considered patience of someone who had already thought it through. They named her Clara Ruth Hawkins, Clara, for a new beginning with a name that had old history in it. Ruth for her grandmother, who held the baby for the first hour with an expression that was beyond grief and beyond joy, and was simply love in its most elemental form. Nathaniel, at 18 months, examined his sister with the thorough skepticism of a firstborn encountering the second, and then, apparently satisfied by his examination, patted her head with one small hand in a manner that was both careful and proprietary. And Adelaide looked at Cyrus over the scene with an expression that said everything about what kind of children they were raising. The years moved forward with the steady, accumulating grace of a life well constructed. The ranch grew, not dramatically but solidly, as the cattle business rewarded consistency and good stewardship. Nora and Thomas had a daughter of their own in the spring following Nora's first winter as a married woman, and then another daughter 2 years after that, and the 12 miles between the two households became a road well traveled in both directions, with children moving along it in both directions on any given Sunday. The kitchen garden became, over the years, something that visitors commented on, which Adelaide accepted with quiet pride and Ruth accepted with straightforward pride, because they had built it from packed earth and dry seeds and plain stubbornness, and it was worth being proud of. Abel Torres, who had been with the ranch for 4 years by then, had developed a loyalty to the Hawkins spread that was permanent in the way that some people take to a place and simply do not leave it, and he had become as much a part of the household as the walls. Pete Vargas was married in his turn, to a woman from a ranch 3 miles east named Juanita, who arrived on the scene with the clear-eyed competence of someone who had grown up on working land and knew exactly what she was choosing. Adelaide and Juanita became friends with the particular warmth of two women who respect each other's intelligence. And Sunday meals at the Hawkins table grew larger and louder by degrees, until the table itself needed to be extended, which Cyrus accomplished with 2 additional boards that Adelaide told him in advance were going to be necessary, and he acknowledged afterward she had been entirely right. He acknowledged this regularly, in the general sense, which was that Adelaide was usually right about most things, and he was usually right about a smaller set of things, and together they were right about nearly everything, which was the specific mathematics of a good partnership. There was an evening in the 5th year when Nathaniel, 3.5 now and deeply interested in the horses with Nora's same instinct, came running in from the barn to find Cyrus sitting at the table with the ranch accounts, and announced with full seriousness that the roan gelding had been looking at the east fence differently, and that he thought it needed checking. Cyrus looked at his son. His son looked back with Adelaide's steady eyes in his own dark-haired face, completely confident in his assessment. Adelaide was in the doorway and he looked at her, and she made the small, managed smile. "He's right," she said. "I noticed it this morning." He went and checked the fence. It was loose in 2 places. He fixed it and came back and told his son, and Nathaniel received this confirmation with the satisfaction of a person who simply expects to be right about such things, and has not yet been given reason to doubt it. Ruth taught Nathaniel to cook eggs when he was 4, sitting him on the stool beside the stove with the gravity of someone imparting genuine knowledge. She taught Clara the same thing at 4. She taught them about the garden and the names of things, and the way weather smelled different before and after rain. She was 60 by then, and her knee was considerably worse, but she had stopped pretending it didn't hurt as much as it did, which was an accommodation to reality that her family received with relief. Adelaide had arranged for her to have the best room in the house, the south-facing one that got warm morning light, and Cyrus had built her a second chair for the porch, slightly lower and easier on the knee, without making any announcement about why. Ruth sat in that chair on the porch in the evenings and watched her grandchildren run across the yard and felt, by her own account, that she had been given more than she had any rational right to expect. "When we drove into Millhaven with nothing left," she told Adelaide once, when Adelaide had come to sit with her as the evening came in, "I was afraid for the first time in my life. Not for me, for you and Nora. I was afraid I had led you somewhere that wasn't going to hold." Adelaide looked at the yard, where Nathaniel was attempting to teach Clara something involving a stick and what appeared to be a very patient opinion about the direction of the wind. "You didn't lead us," Adelaide said. "Came together. You answered that advertisement," Ruth said. "You were so determined. You went to meet that man and you came back to the boarding house and said, 'Mother, Nora, pack up,' and you had this expression," she shook her head, "like someone who has just found a door they knew was there." Adelaide smiled. "I walked out onto that porch and he was standing there, and he was, so she thought, honest looking. That's the only way I can say it, like he meant everything he was going to say before he said it." "And then you made him hire all 3 of us," Ruth said. "I told him the truth and let him decide," Adelaide said. "You knew he'd say yes," Ruth said. Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "I hoped," she said. "I was surprised a little." "Were you?" Ruth said. Adelaide looked at the house, at the lamp already burning in the kitchen window, at the solid walls and the good roof and the garden and the land beyond it. "No," she said, "not really. I think I knew from the moment he handed me those bean seeds." Ruth laughed softly. Adelaide laughed too, and leaned her head briefly against her mother's shoulder in the way she had done since she was very small, and they sat together in the evening with the children in the yard and the lamp in the window and the wide Texas sky pressing down, enormous and full of stars, over everything that they had built. Inside the house, Cyrus was going over the accounts at the table, which was something he did in the evenings with less concern than he once had, because the numbers had been running toward sufficiency for some time now, and had recently begun running towards something that might be called prosperity. He heard Adelaide laugh from the porch, that full, unmanaged laugh, and set down his pencil and sat back in his chair and just listened to it for a moment. Then Nathaniel came in the back door, because he always came in the back door, and climbed into the chair across from his father with the air of someone who had important things to report. "Clara says the red tomatoes are almost ready," he said. "Your grandmother says the same thing," Cyrus said. "Grandma said we could have the first one tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "She said we each get a slice." "That sounds exactly right," Cyrus said. Nathaniel considered him across the table with Adelaide's eyes. "Are you happy, Papa?" The words settled around him like the good smell of the house coffee and cooking and wood smoke and warm rooms. And through the window he could see the porch where Adelaide and Ruth were sitting in the evening, and beyond them the garden that had been planted in dry earth with saved seeds 4 years ago and was now abundant and real, and beyond that the land that had been his alone and was now something bigger than him, something held between many hands. "Yes," he said to his son, "I am deeply happy." Nathaniel nodded once, satisfied, and slid out of the chair to go find his sister and the matter of the tomatoes. Cyrus sat alone at the table for another moment, and let the happiness be exactly what it was, not the dramatic thing of novels or songs, not the loud happiness of victories, but the quiet, profound, daily happiness of a man who had ridden into town one spring morning to hire one person for the season, and had come home with 3 women who had changed everything, and who would spend the rest of his life grateful for every single thing that had followed. Adelaide came in from the porch as the night settled fully in, closing the back door softly behind her, and crossed the kitchen to where he was sitting and stood behind his chair with her hands on his shoulders. He reached up and covered her hands with his. "She's gone in," she said. "Mother, her knee was hurting." "I'll check on her," he said. "She said good night and that you are not to fuss," Adelaide said. "I will check on her quietly," he said. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. He closed his eyes. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and full of stars, the way it always was out here where there was nothing between you and the sky to diminish it. The land lay under it dark and patient, holding its cattle and its grass and its kitchen gardens and its fence lines, and all the small and large structures of a life that had been made with intention, built by hands that knew how to work and hearts that had been willing to open to what was offered. Tomorrow the tomatoes would be ready. Ruth would cut the first one on the kitchen table with the seriousness of ceremony, and there would be a slice for everyone, and the summer would begin to turn toward fall in the long golden way of Texas autumns, and the work would continue, and the meals would come at the right times, and the lamp would be burning when people came home to it, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch in the cooling air, and watch the stars come out one by one over the wide land that was theirs, all of them together, held by everything they had built, and everything they had chosen, and everything that had chosen them in return. The door to Ruth's room was quiet when he checked. He stood outside it for a moment and heard her steady breathing. He went back to the kitchen, where Adelaide was putting out the lamp, and she turned at the sound of his footsteps, and in the last light he could see her face, that face he knew better now than his own, and she held out her hand and he took it. They walked together down the hall. Behind them the kitchen went dark, and the lamp's last ember went out, and the house settled into the deep particular quiet of a place where everyone inside it is safe and together and accounted for, and the night wrapped around it, and the stars pressed down over the Texas panhandle with their ancient, indifferent beauty. Over a ranch that had been made into a home by 3 women who had nothing left to stay for somewhere else, and a man who had come to hire one person, and instead found everything he had needed all along.